welcome to the National World War II Museum's podcast series, Service on Celluloid. This is our mini-episode where I will answer comments and questions from the previous episode. My name is Seth Paradin, historian and digital content manager here at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, and today we'll be continuing our discussion on the 1949 film Battleground. The film focuses on the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment of the famous 101st Airborne Division while they are encircled at Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge. Battleground was directed by William Wellman and written by Robert Peroche. It stars Van Johnson, John Hodiak, Ricardo Montalban, George Murphy, and James Whitmore. The film was a financial and critical success, earning 6 Academy Award nominations and winning for Best Cinematography Black and White and Best Story and Screenplay.
The Battle of the Bulge in Bastogne, we went in by trucks. We were called in hurriedly, and we were in an area in France, and we all went in by trucks to Bastogne. We got set up, dug foxholes in the weather was, of course, the winter time, and we dug foxholes, and even with this entrenching tool, I didn't think I could cut through that frozen ground and dig a hole in there big enough to stay in. But when your life is on the line, you do it.
That was the voice of John Pogue. Mr. Pogue was a rifleman in the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment of the 101st, and as you'll recall, the 327th is the unit portrayed so accurately in the movie Battleground. Battleground is, in my opinion, a love letter to the ground-pounding infantrymen in the ETO in World War II. We discussed that, pretty thoroughly in the main episode. But there are so many little details that only an infantryman would pick up on. It's blatantly clear who this movie was made for and who it was aimed at. The lingo and jargon in the movie is spot on, dead accurate for World War II Army slang. Many of the nicknames and slang words are spouted throughout the movie in places that are appropriate in conversation, too. And by that I mean the words aren't thrown in or the scene wasn't built around them. They just roll naturally off the tongue of the actors as they're saying them. And there's a slew of terms in this movie that I think are really cool. And again, having known many World War II veterans, these are sayings and terms that I heard all the time. One that Holly, Van Johnson's character, says, he gives his rank as a PFC, and he calls it praying for civilian. And that's very accurate, especially for this time of the war, December 1944. You take it for granted that these guys in this unit are veterans, as we said in the main episode, and they've been around for a while. And they're sick and tired of the war. They're tired of it. They're tired of the killing. They're tired of the fighting. They're tired of the deprivations of daily life. And they are praying for civilian. There was a saying back then during the end of the war was, as the war continued to drag, especially in the European theater after the Battle of the Bulge had begun, it was the Golden Gate by 48. They thought that the war was going to last a little bit longer than it actually did. Another couple of slang terms that they use in this movie is saddle up. You'll hear, if you ever watch any John Wayne World War II or any John Wayne war movie at all, you hear the Duke utter that quite often. But that's something that was and still is a common term in the military, especially for an infantryman. That just basically means, put your gear on, get up, and get ready to move. One of the things that is harped on continually through the movie, if you listen to it, are terms called incoming mail and outgoing mail. Now, they're not talking about the U.S. Postal Service. What they're talking about here is incoming and outgoing artillery. You'll hear them say it throughout the movie. Is that incoming mail or is that outgoing mail? And that's an indicator of how long these guys had been in the field. They could tell by the sound that the artillery shells made, whether or not it was our artillery going out towards the enemy or their artillery coming in. Incoming mail means it's incoming fire. Outgoing mail means it's outgoing artillery fire. And while the sounds in the movie aren't necessarily all that accurate, that's probably one of the only things in the movie that isn't really accurate. The fact that they put those lines in there and that they had the characters in the movie, the soldiers in the movie, recognize that is, again, it's a dead ringer that whoever wrote this movie, and of course we know who wrote it, was a combat veteran, and he knew what this was all about. Towards the end of the movie, Holly, who's Van Johnson's character, is promoted to sergeant because of the casualties within the platoon. I think it's Wallowitz who gets hit in the shoulder, and Holly takes his helmet, and Wallowitz basically just promotes him right away. He didn't really have the authority, but he basically said, here, you got the squad now. You're squad leader. You're sergeant now. Being the soldier that he is, Holly takes his new responsibility to heart and starts slinging orders to check for the men to check their weapons for frozen bolts. And by bolts, I'm talking about the bolts that operated the weapon. On an M1, you'd pull the bolt back to insert the end block, the 8-shot end block clip into the chamber of the weapon, and then slam the bolt forward, or it would actually do it itself. And if you didn't get your thumb out of there quick enough, you get what they would call the M1 thumb, where the bolt would slam forward on your thumb. And I've done it myself. It's not pleasant, but this was a common issue in the Ardennes, and the frozen bolts. The weather was so cold that a lot of the weapons, not all the time by any means, but a lot of the weapons, the oil in the weapons actually froze. And I mean, for oil to freeze, and you're talking, this is some seriously cold weather. And it's pretty cool because Holly now takes his new role as a squad leader to heart. And one of the first orders he gives is to check those frozen bolts. And he keeps barking orders at his people to make sure that they're doing what they need to do to stay alive. And so much so that another veteran within the unit, and this guy, I don't remember his name, but the actor is Gunsmoke's Jim Arness. He makes a comment that Holly's making a noise like a sergeant. And Holly replies by saying, quote, "Strictly chicken, that's me. Let's be checking those bolts," unquote. Strictly chicken, or chicken rather. Chicken, of course, is being a slant towards the term chicken defecation, shall we say. That particular term being used in a variety of ways, from describing a stupid order given by someone they didn't respect to describing faulty equipment or gear. Another GI phrase or term is the name Mac, and this is really cool, I think. Mac was anybody in a green uniform whom you didn't know. Platoon Sergeant Kenny yells at his men to get moving. He points a finger at a random trooper and he hollers, "You too, Mac." That means you're coming too, whether you like it or not. There's many other terms that are eloquently laid out in Battleground, such as like the belly rubber, who's the cook, a Holy Joe, who's the chaplain, and the pill roller, who's the doctor or the medic. And the movie does an excellent job of portraying the life of the GI. Many of these items are mundane, everyday things for a soldier, such as digging foxholes. But as you'll hear in the next oral history clip from Philadelphia native Ed Heffron, compounded by the relentless cold, lack of proper clothing and equipment, not to mention the enemy, even ordinary everyday infantry things like digging foxholes in the frozen Ardennes forest was anything but mundane and easy. Let's listen to what Babe has to say here.
It's not good. If it wasn't a lady here, I'd tell you it's not good. And it got worse. No, the weapons became bad. You had to do things to the machine gun so it'd operate again. You had to do different things, and it was just, you couldn't get warm. You laid down in a foxhole, the snow and dirt would get in your back, and you couldn't. Where you going to get washed? You couldn't even strip and wash. It was so goddamn cold. 5 below, 8 below, 30, 40-mile winds coming through the trees. Snow, they said 8 feet. It was more than 8 feet. In open fields where nobody was, it was a hell of a job getting through them. No, it was bad. I told you, they left us there with nothing. Absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing. And if the Krauts had knew it, and I don't care who tells you any different, if the Krauts had knew we had nothing, they would have taken Bastogne. But they were scared of the airborne. They were scared of what we had. They knew we had the belly to do it. But they also thought we had the firepower, which we didn't. We didn't have nothing. We were hungry for 2 or 3 days, and the weather broke, and they sent the 47s over and dropped the supplies to us, food. But that's the only, I had nothing to do with ammo or nothing. And I faintly remember ever getting any resupplies of that. No. Well, they said the weather of 75 years was the worst storm in 75 years in Belgium. I believe it. Well, just trying to dig a foxhole was all we had, the woods, the trees. You know the branches under the trees? You had to try digging a hole over branches. Try that. But you didn't know where the branches ended, or you would have started there digging. The whole thing was bad, real bad, everything.
That was 101st Airborne veteran Edward Babe Heffron. Astute listeners will recognize that name as one of the veterans from Easy Company 506 of the 101st, made famous by Stephen Ambrose's book and the miniseries entitled Band of Brothers. Babe came into Easy Company as a replacement after the Normandy campaign and fought with him through the remainder of the war. The 101st really stuck out on a limb during the Bulge, and as he alluded to, they dealt with being thrown into a situation in which they were not at all prepared. That's not to say that other line units in the Bulge were any more prepared than the 101st, but most of the line units at least had winter clothing. And by line units, I'm talking about infantry divisions like the 99th or the 106th or the 2nd Infantry Division that was up on the line. These guys had been, especially the 2nd, had been in combat, like then at that stage. The 2nd had launched an attack launched an offensive north of the Bulge, or what is called the Northern Shoulder. And these guys were well equipped for the winter combat that they were participating in because they were already in winter combat. The 101 was not. They were not on the line. They were back in a rest camp in France when they got, literally told, wake up, get in trucks, you're moving to the front. They barely had time to, grab an extra pair of socks, much less be issued winter gear. Such was the haste in which the 101st, or the Screaming Eagles as they were known, were thrown into the fire that they were, as I said, not issued proper winter gear. As was shown in the film, the men were preparing to go to Paris. A lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of them were going to Paris for R&R, and they were not prepared to go back to the line and stem a German counteroffensive. Ill-equipped for a winter fight, the men did the best they could in the midst of the worst winter Europe had seen in nearly 100 years. Cut off and surrounded, the Germans demanded the surrender of the 101st. Surrender, of course, did not occur. The unit stood strong against everything the Germans could throw at them and then pushed the enemy back in town after town all the way back to the German border.
History may not tell the story of Bastogne the way it should be, but if I ever am quoted, I make that same statement, that it was the greatest feat of arms by the history of any division, World War II in Europe, period. And if someone is a real student of history and knows the extreme cold conditions that we were under, the clothing that we had, supplies that we had or didn't have, and the mud and the ground that we were living in, and all the snow that we had virtually daily, every night below freezing, sometime in the teens. There isn't anything that can compare to that by a division with those kind of conditions that you had to contend with, and medically bad, and when they were that threatened to annihilate us. Why, Joe Toy had been hit by a fragment bomb. He was out on an outpost and got hit in the arm back of Bastogne. He went in, and a couple of days later, why, I see Joe coming up the field, a draw, and comes to my foxhole, and I said, "Joe, what are you doing here?" He said, "They sent everybody out. It was good. If they could use one arm, then they sent them back to the front line." And I said, "I ought to shoot you through the knee and get you the hell out of here." And he said, "No, I'll be all right." And anyway, the reason for that was that the ultimatum was that they were going to destroy all of Bastogne, and then when they did that, they were going to destroy all of us if the division didn't surrender.
That was 101st Airborne veteran Don Malarkey. Malarkey was also a member of Easy Company 506. He was an original member, though. Don was what they call a Toccoa man. He was with the unit from its inception, and he stayed with the unit for the entire war. He was one of the few guys really to never really be pulled from the front lines, except for just a couple of rests and very few and far between, for that matter, for the whole war. I mean, he was there from the time they were formed until the time they were sent home. He talks about how the 101st actions in holding Bastogne should be recognized as a great feat of arms, and I have to agree as a historian. The defense of Bastogne and the surrounding areas was certainly, it's without a doubt, the 101st greatest moment during the war in an already storied resume. I mean, they'd jumped into Normandy, they'd gone into Holland, and now this. And even through the end of the war, this would be their defining moment. It really was. And it's still, I mean, they've done a lot of great things since then, obviously, but this is still really what the 101st is really, really well known for, is their defense of Bastogne. And it should be noted that Bastogne was such a hotly contested area because of its location. Bastogne was and still is the intersection of 7 roads that run through the Ardennes. Now, if you've ever been in the Ardennes, it's a very heavily forested area. It's a planned forest, and by that I mean it's harvested regularly for its lumber, and the trees are regularly replanted, and they're planted in very neat, typical Belgian, German, French, whatever you want to call that area, lines. So it's thick, heavy forested areas, rolling hills, steep hills, some of them, small little towns here and there. But the roads that are there, that were certainly there then and they're still there now, are very narrow. And the fact that the Germans mounted not one but 2 offensives through the Ardennes area is rather, remarkable, frankly. They, of course, did it in 1940 when they invaded France in 1940. And or when they invaded France through Belgium in 1940, and they did it again, obviously, here in 1944. By 1944, the German tanks were huge, much bigger than they were in 1940, and it made the maneuvering through the road area and the tight, muddy, nasty road area of the Ardennes even more difficult. So the fact that a town, Bastogne, was the center of a junction of 7 roads. 7 roads came together in this one place, made Bastogne all that much more valuable. As I said, the 7 major arteries that ran through Bastogne included one that ran all the way to Antwerp. Antwerp, Belgium, of course, was the overall strategic objective of the German counteroffensive codenamed Wacht am Rhein, which was otherwise known as the Battle of the Bulge. The German offensive slowed around Bastogne as the 101st and other units threw up intense defensive fights, not allowing the Germans to access the critical road junction that would certainly have drastically helped their timetable as they attempted to race to the River Meuse and ultimately Antwerp. Surrounded for 8 days, the 101st was reached by the 4th Armored Division's lead units on Christmas Day, 1944, thus relieving the encirclement and breaking the siege. Such was the fight the 101st put up that a common phrase was born of those who fought there. Referring to the Germans, they would say, "They got us surrounded, the poor bastards." In the main episode, we talked about the main audience of Battleground, and I'm not going to go back into that now, but one of the things I mentioned in the main episode was a speech given by Holy Joe, quote-unquote, the Padre, quote-unquote, to throw in some GI slang there. He was the Lutheran chaplain. It occurred to me that I never read what I feel to be a beautiful speech, so with that, I will read it to you now. And this is straight from the movie, quote, "Now it's nearly Christmas, and here we are in beautiful Bastogne enjoying the winter sports. And the $64 question is, was this trip necessary? I'll try to answer that. But my sermons, like everything else in the Army, depend on the situation and the terrain. So I assure you, this is going to be a quickie. Was this trip necessary? Let's look at the facts. Nobody wanted this war but the Nazis. A great many people tried to deal with them, and a lot of them are dead. Millions have died, for no other reason except that the Nazis wanted them dead. So in the final showdown, there was nothing left to do except fight. There's a great lesson in this. Those of us who've learned it the hard way aren't going to forget it. We must never again let any force dedicated to a super race or a super idea or a super anything become strong enough to impose itself upon a free world. We must be smart enough and tough enough in the beginning to put out the fire before it starts spreading. My answer to the $64 question is yes. This trip was necessary. As the years go by, a lot of people are going to forget. But you won't. And don't ever let anybody tell you you were a sucker to fight in the war against fascism. And now, Jerry permitting, let us pray." Now, I don't know about you guys, but I think that's a very accurate speech in terms, like we've said it before throughout not just this broadcast, but the main broadcast, is that this movie was directed towards the veteran. It was directed towards the combat veteran, specifically from the European theater. And if that speech doesn't explain that, if that speech doesn't write that out for you in black and white, I'm not really sure what else does. You got to remember when this movie was made. It was made in 1949 or 48, and it was premiered in 1949. And this is when it was premiered 4 years after the war ended. And, much to the disbelief of a lot of people, and we've talked about that, I've talked about that on this podcast in previous episodes, that when the GIs came home, they didn't just put away their duffel bags or their foot lockers or their sea bags or whatever it may have been and get on with their lives. It just didn't happen like that. The records show that there was a high divorce rate in the United States in the late 1940s, the highest it had ever been and ever will be, or, well, I shouldn't say that, ever was to that point, and still holds the record. 1947, I believe, was the highest divorce rate in American history. A lot of things on the home front weren't good. There was a mini recession at the end of World War II. The economy didn't just pick up. It was very difficult for a lot of guys to find jobs. And a lot of the veterans are questioning, well, God dang, why did I go over there? What did I do? What was it really worth it for me to go overseas and go do what I did or go participate in what I participated in? And this speech that the Padre makes in the movie, it in my opinion, it answers those questions. It's directed at those people who are sitting in those seats watching this movie, having those very same thoughts. And it's very legitimate, and it makes a very good point, and it's very poignant. So with that, I want to thank you so much for listening. Tune in next week when we discuss the 1943 classic, Bataan. If you'd like to hear the complete oral histories we played today, please visit our digital collections at www.2online.org. That's www.2online.org. You can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Service on Celluloid. Be sure to rate and review us on iTunes if you like what you hear. I'd like to thank everyone who made this podcast possible, our producer, Tessa Jager, and our sound engineer, Jeremy Burson. This has been a production of the National World War II Museum.